For Nicolas Cochon, murdering his cellmate wasn't the end of his crime, it was only the beginning. After repeatedly stabbing Thierry Baudry with a pair of scissors and suffocating him with a garbage bag, Nicolas wasn't done. What followed was something out of a horror story. Using a smuggled razor blade, he sliced off pieces of Baudry's flesh, still warm, before cooking them on a camping stove with sautéed onions. And then he ate them as though he was in a fine dining restaurant. Oh, and one more detail, he was French. And if you can believe it, this is somehow one of the less insane people we're going to cover in today's video. Grab your shiv and watch your back, because on today's episode of the Infographics Show, we're going inside to look at the world's most dangerous prison inmates. Number 15. Nicolas Cochon. This despicable act of prison violence took place in 2007, earning Nicolas Cochon the nickname the Cannibal of Rouen. What started this argument that led to a brutal act of cannibalism? A disagreement about the state of the prison toilets. That's why you don't leave the seat up, folks. According to Mr. Cochon, he made multiple requests for psychiatric help from the prison staff, fearing that he might be violent. No one was listening to me, he said. I made several appeals for help, saying I was a man capable of being dangerous. I took action and then they took me seriously. We don't think anyone can deny that he proved his point. Let's look at another horrific act of prison murder and mutilation. Number 14. Michael Hernandez. Michael Hernandez was a man who didn't take things lightly, and when it comes to dealing with his cellmate, his response was anything but ordinary. His victim was 58-year-old Larry Mark, who was doing time in a prison 47 miles north of Gainesville, Florida, on a first-degree murder charge. Larry had made plenty of mistakes in his life, but none as fatal as the last one, allegedly pestering Hernandez. Crucially, Hernandez was already serving a life sentence for his crimes, with little possibility of parole. That meant he had nothing to lose and a lot to gain in do not mess with me prison cred. He had murdered an elderly woman during a home invasion, and during his sentencing for that crime, he had further charges lumped on for threatening to murder the president. Clearly not the kind of guy you want annoyed at you, but Larry was jaded, having been in jail since 1982. In 2018, when Larry Mark pushed Hernandez a little too far, Hernandez pulled out a prison shank and stabbed his roomie to death. But it didn't end there. Hernandez had a flair for the theatrical, so he also rolled up Mark's body in a sheet, cut off one of his ears, and then made it into a pendant. When Hernandez walked into the mess hall for breakfast proudly wearing Mark's dangling severed ear around his neck, the guards suddenly became aware of what had happened. Hernandez was given another life sentence for his crime, which is great because clearly the first life sentence did wonders in curbing his more violent tendencies. Speaking of terrifying killer inmates who seem to have a lifelong grudge against eyes, let's head on over to the British Isles for the life and crimes of Gary Vinter, another man who was just seemingly addicted to violence. Number 13. Gary Vinter. Vinter was first sent to prison in 1996 after murdering his colleague, Carl Eden. He'd stabbed Carl 37 times, puncturing every single one of his organs. He was imprisoned only to be released almost 10 years later in 2005. To the surprise of no one, he almost immediately went back to prison for his part in a pub brawl. Sadly, Gary was just getting started. He was released again in 2008, being considered a model prisoner. He would not be considered that for long. He stabbed his ex-wife to death in his own mother's home, sending him straight back to the big house. In 2011, he had a brutal altercation with child killer Roy Whiting. Gary used the sharpened handle of a toilet brush to mutilate Roy, earning him an indefinite sentence. And he still wasn't done. In 2014, Gary attacked another lifer, another man with 2 murders to his name, Lee Newell. The attack destroyed one of Lee's eyes and left him with a traumatic brain injury. And what motivated this attack? Well, Gary wasn't happy with the prison's gym facilities. He thought that if he murdered another inmate, he might get transferred to a facility with a better gym. Sometimes the reason for a murder can be every bit as horrible as the murder itself. Number 12. Jackson Vogel. This was definitely the case for 24-year-old Jackson Vogel. Vogel's prejudices drove him to brutally murder his 19-year-old cellmate, Micah Loreno, in Wisconsin's Green Bay Correctional Institution. Micah was serving a year in jail for being party to a substantial battery, but according to everyone who knew him, a good kid with potential who had just fallen in with the wrong crowd. Vogel? Not so much. He was serving a 40-year sentence for the attempted murder of his own mother. He stabbed her repeatedly, strangled her, and even tried to snap her neck. You can already see the problem with placing these two inmates together. On August 27, 2024, a guard making his regular patrols found that Vogel had placed a piece of paper over the window into their cell. When the guard told Vogel to remove the piece of paper, he suddenly saw Micah's corpse hanging from the top of their bunks, his ankles and wrists tied with orange material. He had been tortured and strangled to death, an act which Vogel described as, quote, ecstasy. When Vogel was removed from the cell during the murder investigation, authorities uncovered more than they expected. Alongside strips of orange fabric used to bind Micah, they found a chilling piece of paper scrawled with the words, "Kill all humans." The note was littered with expletives, targeting black and gay people, painting a disturbing picture of Vogel's state of mind. And yet, somehow, Jackson Vogel seemed like a model citizen compared to our next contestant. Number 11. Jamie Osuna. Jamie Osuna is a self-proclaimed Satanist killer who the media nicknamed the Man of 1,000 Faces for his extensive series of face tats. He was first arrested for the horrific torture and murder of single mother Yvette Pena, which he took a great deal of pride in. Going to prison didn't help mellow Jamie out. In fact, it only made him more violent and creative. His cellmate in Corcoran State Prison, 44-year-old Luis Romero, met a horrific end in 2019, when Osuna decided to turn him into a grisly arts and crafts project while the guards were looking the other way. Using smuggled weapons, Osuna murdered Romero and engaged in some of the most disgusting mutilations imaginable. Romero was decapitated, had various body parts removed, and a smile carved into his face. If that wasn't disturbing enough, Osuna scrawled "ha ha ha" on the cell wall using Romero's blood and crafted a necklace from the severed remains. But what's scarier? A fellow inmate that might murder you because they're edgy and evil like Jamie Osuna, or one that might kill you for no good reason at all because they're completely out of touch with reality. Number 10. Michael Harkin. Dan Childs would probably say the latter if he hadn't been murdered in HMP Bristol by his mentally unstable cellmate, Michael Harkin, in summer of 2024. Not only was Childs' murder sadistic, it was also for the most bizarre reason ever. It was because his surname had the word child in it. Harkin got it into his head that his cellmate was a pedophile, something that was completely untrue, but that didn't stop Harkin from planning to punish him accordingly. Childs was tormented over a long period by Harkin, who told him that if he slept, he would suffocate him. This turned out to be more than an idle threat. On June 4th, while Childs slept, Harkin wrapped a TV cord around his neck and strangled him before gently tucking him into bed. But Harkin wasn't done. With one cellmate murdered, he decided to find his former cellmate and then go for a kill streak. Harkin crept up behind his former cellmate in the showers and launched a frenzied attack, slashing wildly with an improvised weapon and intent on murder. The only reason his assassination attempt failed was the quick action of another prisoner who heard the victim's screams and intervened. Armed with a long-handled mop, the prisoner managed to fend Harkin off until the guards arrived. After being convicted of manslaughter, Harkin was transferred out of the jail and into a new permanent position at the high-security Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital. Broadmoor, incidentally, is also briefly the stomping ground of our next deadly inmate, who in his prime probably would have eaten anyone else on the list so far for breakfast. Number 9. Robert Maudsley. Robert Maudsley is a self-proclaimed vigilante and hunter of creeps. After murdering a man who propositioned him for sex in 1974, Maudsley was sent to Broadmoor after he was deemed psychologically ill. But this wasn't the end of him. In fact, he was just getting started on his incarcerated killing spree. In 1977, he and a fellow inmate locked themselves in a room with 26-year-old David Francis, a convicted abuser of children. They tortured David to death over the course of 9 solid hours, causing him unimaginable pain before killing him. This got a manslaughter charge appended to Maudsley's ever-growing rap sheet. He was transferred from Broadmoor to Wakefield Prison, which Maudsley took issue with and requested a transfer back. Perhaps they should have listened to him. He'd commit another 2 brutal murders on the same day at Wakefield, making him officially the most prolific killer on this list so far. It was July 29, 1978, when Maudsley decided he wanted to try to kill 7 prisoners in a single day. First was the wife killer, Salney Darwood, who Maudsley garroted and then stabbed to death before hiding his corpse under his bed. After that, Maudsley tried to lure other prisoners into his cell so he could commit a second murder there, but given that Maudsley was not only a known killer, but also very creepy, it didn't work. Instead, with an improvised dagger in hand, he went on the prowl looking for a new victim to kill. He found 56-year-old sex offender William Roberts lying in bed and decided to violently stab him to death and slam his head up against the wall. Once he was done, Maudsley casually walked into the office of the prison wing, drenched in blood, and placed his dagger down on the desk, then said that there would be 2 fewer people at roll call that day. Since then, he's been kept in solitary confinement in a cell designed especially for him. But having your own specially designed cell is one thing. What happens when you're such a dangerous inmate that your exploits inspire the creation of its own supermax prison? Number 8. Tommy Silverstein. Tommy Silverstein, also known as Terrible Tom, was the former leader of the Aryan Brotherhood white supremacist prison gang. Tommy found himself institutionalized in brutal reform schools from a young age. His cruel and domineering mother taught him that the only way to avoid being a victim is to hit back harder and with far more brutality. Tommy took this message to heart and became a violent thug for the rest of his life. That was until a string of armed robberies landed him with a 15-year sentence in Leavenworth, Kansas, and that's where he developed his ties with the Aryan Brotherhood, one of the most ruthless prison gangs in the U.S. The first of his several prison murders was Danny Atwell, who refused to act as a heroin mule, so Silverstein killed him. Tommy then got transferred to the United States Penitentiary Marion in Illinois, where he was kept in the control unit for dangerous prisoners. In this prison, he'd later strike up a friendship with fellow neo-Nazi creep Clayton Fontaine and face off against a black prison gang called the DC Blacks. As a part of this ongoing prison race war, Tommy and Clayton murdered rival gang member Robert Chappelle, and later the DC Blacks' national leader Raymond Lee Cadillac Smith. Smith had it out for Tommy, but Tommy was still his mother's son. He and Clayton murdered Smith by stabbing him a horrific 67 times before hanging his body from an elevated prison walkway to show off to the other inmates. Tommy was certainly sending a strong message. He was one of the scariest men in the U.S. prison system. In 1983, Officer Merle Klutz found himself on the receiving end of Tommy's wrath after allegedly destroying some of his paintings. Tommy made an elaborate plan which involved the collaboration of other prisoners involving a shiv and a homemade handcuff key. After breaking from his restraints, Tommy brutally murdered Officer Klutz, and not long after, Tommy's buddy Clayton used this exact same technique to murder another prison officer, Robert Hoffman. In response, he was sentenced to decades in solitary confinement, later becoming the longest-held prisoner in solitary confinement in American history. His murder of Officer Klutz would also serve as the inspiration for the creation of USP Florence AdMax, a hardcore supermax prison in Colorado, created specifically to prevent incidents like this from ever happening again. And that's the legacy of Tommy Silverstein. How about we introduce a little gender equality into the mix? After all, it's not just the men who can be terrifying, dangerous inmates. Number 7. Rebecca Butterfield. Despite Rebecca Butterfield's whimsical name, she is a dangerous and unstable sadist eager to enact violence on whoever she can, even her best friend. While detained at the high-security Silverwater Women's Correctional Center in Australia, she racked up an astonishing 110 disciplinary violations. Among them were 40 assaults on others and just as many self-inflicted incidents, including a horrifying episode where she bashed her head against a wall 105 times, splitting her skull open. She was also known to regularly attack guards and doctors in sudden fits of rage. Her methods included stabbing, biting, and throwing objects at them, including colostomy bags, boiling water, and even her own urine. But in her most brutal incident of all, she turned against her only friend, Blue Slim Ward, for seemingly no reason, stabbing her to death. Rebecca also promised that if she was ever released from prison, she would definitely kill again. Not that being in prison was really stopping her. So far, we've mainly dealt with gangsters and psychopaths killing people in jail to get revenge, gratification, or respect. But what about the escape artists? The inmates who will stop at nothing to taste freedom again, even if it means slaughtering anyone in their way. This was the case for another classic tattooed scoundrel, Ricky DuBose. Number 6. Ricky DuBose. Ricky's most famous act of violence didn't actually take place in the prison itself, but on a bus transporting him and around 30 other prisoners. He and an accomplice, Donnie Rowe, slipped out of their handcuffs and barged their way into the bus's cab. They shot the guard and the driver, Sergeant Christopher Monica and Sergeant Curtis Bilyeu, with their own stolen guns. They managed to escape after this, before being recaptured, at which point Ricky was convicted and given the death penalty. though he was found dead in his cell 10 days later. Our next inmate might not be somebody you've heard of, but you definitely know one of his victims. Number 5. Christopher Scarver. When Christopher Scarver first entered prison, he was known as a man who killed during a botched robbery in June 1990. Suffering from messianic delusions, he sometimes referred to himself as Christ. But Scarver's place in the annals of crime history wasn't secured by that crime alone. It was his fateful encounter with one of the world's most notorious killers, Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee cannibal. Many of his fellow inmates have said that Dahmer was an unpleasant man to be around in jail. Not surprising, given he was a sadistic, serial-killing necrophiliac. He regularly creeped out the other prisoners by making references to his crimes, and given that the majority of Dahmer's victims had been people of color, this hit a little too close to home for Christopher Scarver, so he decided to take matters into his own hands. While Dahmer and convicted wife killer Jesse Anderson were cleaning the prison gym, Scarver grabbed the metal rod from a barbell and bludgeoned Dahmer in the head with it. Scarver then beat Jesse Anderson to near death with a wooden stick. After doing this, he went to the prison authorities and said, "God told me to do it. Jesse Anderson and Jeffrey Dahmer are dead." We think that Christopher Scarver probably would have gotten on well with Robert Maudsley if they ever met. Now let's go back to another female convict who just can't seem to keep out of trouble, this time from the Great White North, Canada. Number 4. Renee Jeanette Akobe. The deadly inmate in question is Renee Jeanette Akobe. She's the first woman in Canada to be given the label of dangerous offender, entailing both a permanent stay in prison and special security considerations. So what did Akobe do to earn such a menacing title? Back in 2001, Akobe was being held in an Aboriginal healing lodge when she and a fellow inmate attacked a guard. Akobe's co-conspirator coshed the guard over the head with a sock filled with pieces of metal, and Akobe then held a knife to her throat, threatening to murder her. Thankfully, the guard survived, but Akobe was just getting started with her one-woman war against the Canadian correctional system. In 2002, she took it up a notch and slashed a guard's face with what was very likely a razor blade. The guard survived but was left with some pretty nasty wounds. That same year, Akobe and another friend tied up an inmate and tortured her with broken glass to the legs. This resulted in a hostage situation that lasted 4 hours before the captured inmate narrowly escaped with her life. Things didn't calm down for Akobe in 2003. Teaming up with another accomplice, she launched a brutal attack on an inmate with learning disabilities. Armed with a wooden handle and a metal bar, Akobe beat the woman mercilessly, leaving her with severe injuries across her body. Remarkably, the victim survived, but just barely. In 2004, she held another inmate hostage using a homemade shiv made out of a toothbrush and a razor blade, which she held up to the fellow inmate's throat. And in 2005, another accomplice helped Akobe take a pair of guards hostage, torturing them over a number of hours. They were forced to take medications, had their bodies cut, and had cigarettes put out on their skin. One of the guards got a particularly rough ride, getting chunks of her hair pulled out, having air freshener sprayed into her eyes, and getting repeatedly punched in the face. In 2007, when Akobe was being escorted to the prison showers by 3 armed guards, she turned the tables and created yet another hostage situation. She pulled out a sharp screw she'd taken from a CD player and held it to one of the guards' throats, threatening to pierce a vital artery if her demands weren't met. She then wrapped a belt around the guard's neck and demanded, among other things, a transfer to a different institution, cigarettes, and a soda. Now for a bit of a monster-on-monster crime from New England. Number 3. Mark Hobson. You may not be familiar with the spree killer Mark Hobson, but the more you find out about him, the more you're likely to hate him. Back in 2002, he got into a spat with a love rival and stabbed him 5 times in the chest, puncturing his lung. Hobson's victims survived this incident, but his next ones wouldn't be so lucky. During a vicious 2004 killing spree, he murdered 4 people in North Yorkshire. The first was his girlfriend, Claire Sanderson, who he beat almost to death with a hammer and then strangled her. The second, Claire's sister, Diane. He tied her up and brutally tortured her before murdering her in a similar fashion. Not long after this, he killed an elderly couple, James and Joan Britton, together. Because of the horrific nature of his crimes, he was sentenced to life in prison with the rare recommendation from a judge that he would never be released. While in jail, he had an altercation with a fellow prisoner named Ian Huntley, who had been convicted of drowning 2 young girls in a bathtub. Hobson attacked Huntley and poured boiling water all over him, which led to Hobson being put into solitary confinement. Our next inmate was, for a time, considered to be in the top 10 most dangerous prisoners in the world. He earned that terrifying title, and you're about to find out why. Number 2. James Porky O'Rourke. James Porky O'Rourke has been in prison for over 30 years now, since murdering a man named Neil Kearney back in 1992. Witnesses saw him dropping a large slab of concrete on Neil's head, and in prison, Porky only got more violent. In 1997, he was handed an additional 6 years in prison after taking a prison officer and a nurse hostage for 19 straight hours, threatening their lives throughout. In 2002, he assaulted and abducted another victim in jail, giving him another 8 years in jail. And then in 2004, he gave another attack that scored him 4 more years in the clink. In 2005, Porky made a name for himself at HMP Kilmarnock, where he stabbed a prison escort and a senior jail official with a smuggled blade. That got another 8 years added to his sentence, and in 2019 he got another 9 years for slitting another prisoner's throat in the jail gym. And Porky's prison crime spree was still not over. In 2022, he was given another life sentence after murdering fellow inmate Dean Ramsey. Ramsey was tied up and beaten severely before Porky made a garrote out of bed sheets, wrapped it around the man's throat, and methodically strangled him to death. A source inside the prison said, "It doesn't take much for Porky to flip." That much is actually pretty obvious by now. But no list of the world's most dangerous prison inmates would be complete without one very special and exceedingly violent man. His exploits were so famous that he was even portrayed by Tom Hardy in a 2008 movie based on his life and crimes. Number 1. Charles Bronson. We are talking, of course, about Michael Gordon Peterson, better known by his professional name Charles Bronson. From humble beginnings with a family involved in local politics in his hometown of Luton, Charles's life took a very different path. At just 13, he joined a violent gang, marking the start of his criminal career and leading to his first stint in juvenile detention. As the years went on, he became a more and more violent man, getting into fights with his friends, strangers, and managers at the various jobs he had trouble holding down. In 1974, at the age of 22, Bronson officially started his career as a professional prisoner when he was sent to Walton Jail for robbery. Within a few days, he attacked a pair of other prisoners and got sent to the high-security area known as the punishment block. This would not prove to be an effective deterrent. In 1975, he was transferred to HMP Hale, where he started having altercations with the guards and smashed up the prison workshop. He was taken to the punishment block there and injected with a mood stabilizer that made him sick until he was deemed safe to re-enter the general population. But that didn't work, and he immediately started attacking his fellow inmates again. In the years that followed, he was transferred from prison to prison, leaving a trail of carnage in his wake. He beat up prisoners and guards, destroyed property, and made frequent escape attempts, in one case trying to dig his way out of prison. But he still wasn't done. In 1985, when he was stationed in the infamous Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital, he escaped and performed a rooftop protest, causing $250,000 of property damage in the process. He also took hostages almost constantly at various prisons, with his victims being everyone from his art teacher to a pair of Iraqi hijackers in 1996. It reached a point where his jailers realized that he simply was not safe around any other people. That's why in 1999 he had a special unit built just for him to keep him away from the general prison population for good. These days he's mellowed out and mainly focuses on his painting, a passion so dear to him that since 2014 he's mainly gone by Charles Salvador, as a tribute to the surrealist painter Salvador Dali. His last appeal for parole was rejected in 2023, so it is unlikely that the infamous Charles Bronson will stop being England's most dangerous prisoner anytime soon. Which of these dangerous prisoners shocked you the most? Do you agree they're the worst? Or is someone else more terrifying? Share your thoughts in the comments. Now check out Inescapable Cell, designed specifically for one prisoner, or watch this instead.